We'll call the meeting to order. Welcome and introductions. Everyone, welcome. Thank you for being here. And we'll do introductions, I guess, starting with Brent.
Sure. I'm Brent Stutler. I'm a planner with CYMPO. This will go around.
Hello, Francisco Anaya, EMAC, and Prescott National Forest.
Frank Marbury, I'm with the town of Chino Valley.
Dead Pastor EMAC.
Jeff Gagnon, Dana Fish, I'm filling in for until Elizabeth Johnson's replacement comes in.
Tammy DeWitt, EMAC, and City of Prescott.
Vinny Gallegos, Executive Director of CYMPO.
Leslie Contreras, planner for CYMPO.
Michael Lamar, Regional Development Manager for CYMPO.
Cynthia Alvarez, Burgess and Eichel, consultant.
Dana Viscom, consultant with Burgess and Eichel.
Alice McCarthy, administrative assistant with CYMPO.
And then you got Desi back there.
Desi Richer, program coordinator with CYMPO.
And you got Chuck. Chuck, you want to introduce?
Yeah, I'm the resident now, Chuck Budinger,
Retiree emeritus.
retired. There it is.
Apparently, when you retire, you get booted off the table to the next row of tables. So
Yeah, pretty soon I'll be outside.
we'll never put you outside. So
Goal, right?
Well, eventually.
Bryn has some open.
All right. So welcome, everybody. Looks like we have a quorum, which is wonderful. Do we know whether we have JD online? We don't. Okay, so we are missing JD Greenberg, one of our resident members. Welcome. CYMPO is excited to formally kick off this environmental assessment and carbon reduction strategy planning process. And it's designed to support and more fully identify what the priorities of EMAC will be moving forward. We have named the plan the Environmental Assessment and Carbon Reduction Strategy. The Carbon Reduction Strategy is a new component. It is a pot of funding that has come through some of the new federal legislation. And CYMPO has already gotten an initial apportionment. I think it's about $185,000 or so a year. Here comes JD. And we want to also have that as a sub-scope of this process to identify where the EMAC might want to make recommendations about carbon reduction strategies. So that'll be a part of the planning process. Before we kick it off, a few housekeeping items. Bathrooms are through the rear door, down the hallway, look for the red arrow. There's also a drinking fountain back there. Please silence your cell phones if you haven't already. If you have a question as a committee member, please feel free to raise your hand and jump in at any time. Once our consultant team gets underway, they'll call on you. If you have a question, raise your hand. We don't have, other than Mr. Budinger, we don't have any other members of the public in attendance today. Chuck, if you want to comment or have a question or a comment, we invite you to place your comment or question on a comment card. And our consultant team will be staying after between 2:30 and 3 to address any comments or questions that might come up.
I already feel like I'm being sitting on the outside.
In preparation for the meeting, EMAC members have been provided an original white paper document that set forth the original scope and intent of the EMAC. You guys have also been provided a copy of the scope of work for this planning process, which will help you to connect with what the mission of this process will be. Dana and her team will be working with you as a committee to further define the roles, responsibilities, and intent for the future. And with those opening remarks, I'm going to turn it over to Vinny.
Thank you, Bryn. Just want to add just a few things. Really appreciate Burgess and Eichel, led by Dana Biskin. We've worked with Dana in this region in the past on a number of projects. And we're just always pleased to have your professionalism, your expertise, and innovation that you bring to our region. Thank you especially to Dana and Cynthia for joining us. With that said, we really wanted this meeting to be in person, so we have just the best possible engagement. Virtually, we do have some people that I believe Dana's working with, so if you notice some names that might not be as familiar to you, that's who those are. Just want to lay some of the groundwork of kind of where we're at and how we got here. So I always think it's valuable, you know, when we talk about the priorities of CYMPO and the priorities of the committees that serve under that umbrella, to remind us of the vision and the mission of CYMPO. And it's a one sentence on both. So the vision of CYMPO is to promote and maintain a regional coordinated transportation system for the safe and efficient movement of people, goods, and services, And then the mission is simply this: to use regional leadership in planning and promoting a comprehensive multimodal transportation system. So as I read that and I remind us what that is, I want to acknowledge that we as a staff do the best we can to operate within that vision and the mission of the organization. If you're not familiar of the organization structure or you're newer to what we're doing here, we essentially work for that mission, that vision, but ultimately the executive board that are the elected officials. So myself as the executive director, answer to that executive board. They're the political people chosen from the Quad City area to represent the region and to make decisions on ultimately on priorities, on projects, on policy. And the TAC and the CYMPO staff work to make recommendations to that executive board. It was about 7 years ago, really with the champion of JD and others in the community that came forward and said, look, here's a real opportunity to enhance the way that transportation is being reviewed and looked at, and what acknowledgement is, the greater environment being taken into consideration. And I think at that time, it was JD and others were asked, to go out and collect some signatures and let's see if this is something of community significance. And those signatures came back very strongly, very much in favorably. So, I look back over the time period, and I want to acknowledge this. I want to be really clear that to the best of my knowledge, there is no other MPO like us in the state. There's 6 other MPOs, or there's 6 MPOs in Arizona. There's 4 council of governments, and there's no committee like this. This is not a typical committee. This doesn't exist. So on one hand, I truly applaud us for CYMPO having the people in the community to be passionate about this, the desire to do it, and then ultimately for CYMPO to welcome it. Now, with that said, I think many of us in the room can agree that those 7 years have been a work in progress. And I'm always of the mind, no matter what it is, there's always room for growth and evolution. So I think that really brings us to where we are today in extending an invitation to consultants out there to say, look, as Bryn mentioned, we have some new funding we want to be able to implement, but we also want to look at how we're doing with our existing funding, how we're doing with our existing structure. And there was a few proposals that came in, but the one that rose above was from Burgess and Nyepel that really was able to address what we were looking for. And Allison did send you that scope that came in from Burgess and Nyepel. It was only 2 or 3 pages, but it really did say, all right, let's do a couple things with what CYMPO is looking for. Let's help to identify in the CYMPO region projects that are attainable for a number of reasons. As we're all very familiar with fiscally, that's always an area that constrains us, and politically. And I emphasized already at the beginning of this introduction that the EMAC, the TAC, even staff can have all the ideas in the world, and we could dream as big as we want, and I'm one to promote that. But in the end of the day, we always have to acknowledge who's ultimately making that decision, and it's those executive board members that we have to take into full consideration, and where are their greater priorities. So Burgess and Nyepel is going to help us facilitate a conversation between the EMAC, the staff, and how do we evaluate EMAC's success or work up to this day, and then how do we look at the structure moving forward? How do we really open that up and evaluate that and ask all of ourselves if we're doing the best we can to set you up as a committee for success, number one, and then number two, how does that again all fit within the CYMPO vision and mission? So I know there's a lot of passion in this room, a lot of eagerness, and that's going to be the exciting part for Dana to facilitate, that we all want to get things done. And welcome to bureaucracy that moves at an incredibly glacial pace, doesn't always cooperate because of the hoops we have to jump through, the red tape and all sorts of things. And I'm usually the one to add that that wet blanket to the conversation, and it's not always a fun thing. So I'm glad Dana's here to help me. But it's a balance between let's dream big, but let's kind of remind ourselves of some of those real constraints. So I think those are my opening words, and I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you. And that was very well stated. And I would concur. I've worked with pretty much every MPO in the state as well as in other states. And this is the only group of its kind that I've seen. So, commend all of you for coming together and your passion towards this cause. Do you have a PowerPoint? Thank you. So we'll quickly walk through the scope of our overall project, and then we will kind of have a facilitated dialogue. Okay. So I guess I'll come up there so that I can advance the slides. Okay. So as Betty mentioned, there is a relatively new funding source for carbon reduction program funding, so again, a part of our project is to identify ways that fund.
Is there a microphone or anything? I mean,
Do you
I'm
want me to
really
speak
able
louder?
to hear you.
Sure. All right, is this good? All right. So the first part of our study, there is a new funding source, as Vinny noted, to carbon reduction program funding. So we will be looking for ways that funding could be used within the CYMPO region. We're also going to, per Vinny's point, kind of revisit. You all have this white paper. So this was about 7 years ago. The initial intent, vision, purpose, structure, and scope for the EMAC. Well, 7 years have passed. So it seems it's worthwhile to revisit which things have worked well, which things are okay, maybe which things haven't quite fit right or haven't come together. And the overall intent is, we understand this is a very passionate group. We want to make sure that the things that this group is working towards and advocating for are in alignment with the CYMPO overall objective mission, and that it's providing the most utility to help advance its cause through that platform. So, all right, and this matches this, so you've got it in your hand. But basically, the original purpose of the EMAC, or the mission, is to study and advocate for the preservation of interconnected ecosystems in the CYMPO region that will integrate land use and mitigation for natural resource protection and wildlife habitats into the regional transportation planning and design program. So today, again, this is essentially a working meeting. I will just kind of share what the study scope is so that everyone has awareness. And then we'll talk through with each of you. Actually, we'd like to go kind of round robin and hear kind of what you've been able to do within the role, what you have maybe bandwidth to do outside of these meetings. Because again, when we're talking about what it is that the EMAC is doing or charged with doing, we want to make sure that you've got the resources to be successful. So if, for example, if there are items on this bulleted list that maybe haven't been addressed, is it because there's a lack of, is it too big of an ask? Is there something else that's maybe within the realm of things that are attainable, so we can redirect and make sure that we're prioritizing your time, and again, in alignment with the vision of CYMPO. So task 1, we'll be developing a carbon reduction strategy. Again, that would be in alignment with the carbon reduction program funding that's available. We're going to be, and in support of that, identifying multimodal facilities and mitigation infrastructure, identify potential impacts from planned residential and commercial development on environmental resources, and mapping wildlife migration patterns. And then again, because we know it's multi-years of funding, identify projects to leverage that funding from the carbon reduction plan, identify projects and strategies bigger picture, kind of beyond just that, that could reduce negative impacts to the environment through the transportation lens and helping identify funding opportunities for those enhancements. And then this last one here is kind of what we're going to be focusing on with this initial discussion today. So looking at membership best practices, how is it beneficial to all of you to have meetings, well, we'll be doing meeting facilitation, opportunities and implementation. So the overall kind of schedule for what we're doing for now, then we're collecting various data sets. I believe some of you have gotten correspondence from us asking for some of those GIS data sets so that we can do this mapping. We'll be using that to help identify potential projects, strategies, etc. Justin Hopman is who's on the line. So he's with Aztec, he's an environmental planner. You're nodding, I think you probably know him. So he'll be supporting us with all of those activities. And then we'll have best practices tentatively by January. So we are anticipating that we will meet with you 4 times over the course of this effort. Today being the first, kind of to talk through visioning, so the identification of the CYMPO's priorities and EMAC's role within that, and how to, again, to try to make sure we're making the right asks. The next meeting, we'll talk through roles and responsibilities in alignment with the vision that we're kind of trying to establish today. Then again, we're collecting GIS data, we're doing various things. Are there tools and things that we can use or develop for you to help you be more successful? And then get feedback and look to next steps that are appropriate. So EMAC role. And this is really where I'd like to hear from each of you. Again, you know, it's been 7 years. You have this. I don't know who would like to go. Do you want me to start with you, Francisco, or would you like me to start with you, Tammy? Because I'll just go around. It's up to you two.
I don't have anything yet, so.
Okay. Okay, well, sure, Francisco, can you tell me a bit about kind of some of the things that you've been able to do in support of your role with the EMAC? What you're, because I understand this isn't, you know, you've got a job besides this job. So kind of so we have a better understanding of how much time and availability you have to commit, and then maybe some other thoughts that you have.
Okay, yeah, so I was asked to be on this, I think 5 years ago. Originally, our forest engineer was the Prescott chair. She moved on, so they asked me to be on this committee, and I was voluntold, and so they didn't really tell me what it was. And so that's one thing I've been trying to figure out, where does the forest sit in all of this? The CYMPO boundary does touch the Prescott National Forest boundary quite a bit. And so I met with my forest supervisor, Dale, and my staff officer, and I asked him, like, what was my role in this? What's expected from the forest? They didn't really know either. And so, you know, the way I look at this, because we do have a lot of projects that butt up against the CYMPO boundary, trained as an ecologist, you know, so I do look at, you know, and of course, wildlife doesn't care about boundaries. So the thing I've been trying to do is, you know, looking at like, what is best management practices? A lot of these projects are similar to what we do on the forest. You know, you have a scope of work, proposed action, and what we do is you do your best to mitigate negative effects to wildlife populations. So that's kind of what I've seen my role as. And outside of this, I have very little time to put into EMAC specific projects sometimes, because we got so much going on the forest as well. And that does take a lot of my time, unfortunately. So that's kind of where I am, I guess, with my EMAC role.
And since you mentioned a few of the projects, and this is my perception, so just asking a question, it seems like a lot of times when there are specific projects that you'll provide technical review to the documentation for those?
No,
No.
not for these projects. You know, the first project I remember when I got on was, we were talking about the Highway 69 And, that's when Jeff really talked about the underpass. That's kind of the first time I heard about it. But it seemed like we were a little too late in that, the proposed action, that NEPA was pretty well down the line by the time we got to it. I understand that, being familiar with NEPA. But now at the Sundog connector, I feel like EMAC does have maybe a little bit better role because it's so far out in the future for now that we can provide a lot more information and suggestions and actually do what I think EMAC was intended to do.
Sure, so, well, and I guess we'll use that example. So, and maybe ask them to the additional question. Since you're first, you get to do a lot of talking. So, so how would you, so I used the example of providing a technical document with you. So is that something that, through the lens of wildlife and things like that you could bring to a Sundog connector, or are you already?
I'm not doing that. Like the way I would see that is it wouldn't be any different than like a NEPA project we propose on the forest where we put it out for scoping. Then everyone's able to see that. If they have comments, they can write to the proponent, and then the proponent has to address all those comments. So I would assume we would get that comment on what we would like to see, or what we think makes sense, and then in theory they would have to address those comments.
So what I heard, just to make sure, so, and understandably so, Forest Service is a major time commitment. As a representative of the Forest Service. Oh, I'm sorry. Forest Service is a major time commitment as a representative from the Forest Service. So you are wanting to find ways to contribute to the projects that are taking place within the region, but understand there's maybe limited time available beyond the time spent here, but would potentially, it sounds like, be receptive to providing general comments, though you maybe not a full technical review.
Correct, yeah. And it would be, probably just providing, we have similar projects, on the forest, and we have best management practices in place or mitigations for wild, like these are things we deal with, I deal with on a daily basis. So, being to provide that input, that insight as well. But as far as like a technical review or, reviewing a biological assessment or something, that's I'm a little bit more limited in that time.
Sure. So then being able to provide information on the best practices from a wildlife perspective early in the planning process.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense. And then did you have a chance to read the items in the scope?
I did. And, like as far as like pursuing funding opportunities, that's probably completely out for me.
Okay.
Something like that. I'm doing that on in my regular job for other projects.
Would it be, so understanding, don't have the time to put together the funding request, would it be reasonable to think, and you may already do this, but to share that the funding opportunity exists with CYMPO, and then maybe there would be an opportunity for them to pursue separately?
Yes, and one thing being with the forest that we do a lot with, because I see CYMPO as a partner of the forest. We're all connected here. So if they are going for grants, one thing we do a lot from the forest is like a letter of support from the forest. So our forest supervisor would provide that. So stuff like that.
Okay. All right. Same stuff.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm not a voting member. I'm the liaison for the TAC committee.
Sure.
So my primary role is doing what Vinny tells me to do.
That's my role too.
Yeah. Try and act as a go-between between the EMAC and the TAC, so that if there's questions maybe about roles and responsibilities, try and provide the point of view from the TAC committee in addition to what CYMPO staff provides, and vice versa. When the TAC has questions or needs more input, I can try and put in my point of view of the EMAC's point of view to during the TAC committee meetings is the way I see it. But there's also, I am a engineer and lots of other things in Chino Valley because it's a small town, but so provide assistance, try and, if there's technical assistance about, what do we need in this grant and stuff, just from experience of dealing with grants before. Not as good as the CYMPO staff, but it can try and lend in maybe some of the wording and things and keep it on track to help make it more productive, and facilitate things like that. If that's what you're
Yes.
looking for. You want to
So
add?
I'm gonna do the
Okay.
same thing, because again, we're just trying to make sure, we want an understanding, again, this group has been, together for about 7 years now, so trying to see, this was the initial charge,
Yep.
how has it landed?
Yeah, and also as liaison, I think, Vinny, we rotate every year, give or take.
Yeah, and I just would add a note, Dana, that's relatively a new thing, just in the last year. It's not, we haven't had a TAC liaison. Dan Cherry served on it for a period of time. Frank's now doing it. And kind of the reason was to just make the voice heard of EMAC, to make the better connection in the whole organization. But to Frank's point, it is new and it is an annual rotation, so, yeah.
So I'm pretty new in this and still learning what my role is, so, but willing to participate as much as I can, so.
So in general, you take TAC information, I mean, you play the role of liaison, take information from the TAC, bring it to the EMAC, take information from EMAC, bring it back to the TAC.
Yeah. And as I like to say, rather than just written reports or something, I can provide maybe some of the context, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's great.
Try and communicate the passion that this group has, and also help steer some of maybe explain what the TAC's looking for certain projects or things like for carbon reduction. There's tons of examples we could use and things like that.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah.
As a citizen member, this is all very new to me, so I kind of over the last years just listened, watched, try to read studies, pay attention to what's going on in the area, in the county, in the cities. And transportation and logistics have always fascinated me, so I'm into it on that level. For me, I don't know, I don't work for one of the companies where I have a job that's related to all of this wildlife movement. So I'm a little unclear on what I'm supposed to do to help out. And that way I try to be ready for meetings and read stuff and pay attention, but otherwise we have not been in early on the projects. As Francisco said, that with the Sundog, we have a better chance to do that. For me, I would like to know more of our roles and responsibilities, like as a citizen member, what is it I can do to help? I know that my skill set, I'm not good at finding because I don't know all this grant stuff and where all these opportunities are, but if you gave me a document to read, I'm really good at reading a document and pulling out all different ideas of what we could provide to sway people to do what we want. I'm good at that. And then what I would like is if we did site field trips for some of these things as a group, to know what it is we're looking at, what are all the details, but to actually look at the land, that would be great. What term limits are, how to fill vacancies, review the applications of people that are applying. If people want to leave, do they just raise their hand, I want to leave? Like, what is this about really in that way? And then the prioritization of projects sounds wonderful. And then just direction on how to look at looking for funding and then how to add to it to help get the funding. And it seemed to me after all this time, the last meeting, that what we really would be good at is studies. If we could find funding for studies, because all of these projects don't care what you say unless you have a study. And we can study the whole area and then have all the information ready for when the projects come up on some. We know where the animals move. And maps, better maps, so we can actually have them when a project comes in. It's like, well, here's the map, here's where they go, there's your project, whoops. You know, that kind of thing. And we'll be able to say how many can move less because of a new development or whatever comes in. Okay, they can't go there anymore, some more of them over here by the time the project comes to us. And that is what I have for you.
So it sounds like, in general, you're looking for more awareness earlier in the project development process. I think both you and Francisco kind of voiced that. And then looking for maybe some, like, whether it's GIS-based mapping or something else to kind of know early on, okay, these are potential constraints, and maybe it's to help identify or help flag the need to identify mitigating infrastructure considerations. Is that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm glad this group exists, and I throw no shade on any of it because we have been trying to figure it all out this whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And having y'all come in and help, you know, figure it out, that you guys recognized it and wanted to make it be so that we could be more effective. I think it's great. So I'm not quitting. I don't know what the terms are to get rid of me either, but we're not writing those down.
Could I maybe ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So on the, like the wildlife example, so what you were thinking is maybe one of this group's priorities could be to try and seek out and get maybe wildlife movement studies for the general area, not so much project specific, but just to have those sorts of studies done so that when a project comes in, you can punch that into that project and then look at how the project might affect the
Absolutely.
base study, I think is what she was looking at.
Yeah.
Something this committee may be able to do.
Because we have pieces, you know, there are pieces, but they're old at this point, right?
Some of them.
Yeah, and if we could just kind of put that more together, we know what's coming.
Mhm.
I go to enough meetings to know that on my own. That we could, if we focus more on that, because that's what our job is, right? Wildlife mitigation and.
Yeah, the linkages. Okay, Justin? You there?
Yes, I am.
So to her point, can you speak a little bit about, or maybe someone else in the room is more aware, but I guess the vintage of wildlife linkages in this region?
Yeah, so Game and Fish as well as ADOT developed a study in the early 2000s on a statewide wildlife linkages study, and that identified habitat blocks, large habitat blocks throughout the state, as well as important areas between those habitat blocks to establish linkages. That study was in the early 2000s. In the mid later after 2010 sometime, I don't have the date right in front of me, Game and Fish as well as ADOT and other member agencies, including the counties, developed some county some studies at the county level, which took a little bit more fine-grained approach and looked county by county and developed recommendations for with a little bit more detail about where habitat blocks as well as linkage zones could be located at the county level. So those are two studies that currently exist that identify both large habitat blocks as well as linkage areas within the CYMPO area. So that would be kind of the first level of existing data that show where these areas are.
But we have to look at what things have developed and what new ideas are coming and look about how that is going to affect that data. So couldn't there be more study?
Yes, yeah, certainly there's the opportunity to update that county-wide study to account for changes in land use patterns that have happened over the past 10 years. Obviously, Prescott Valley and Prescott have seen quite a bit of growth over the past 10 years. So there is the opportunity or the need for that study to be looked at again to account for those changes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Oh,
Oh, sorry.
I thought you said my name, I'm
sorry.
done.
So I've got scattered notes here. I'll try to bring some of this together.
Sure.
So one of the things, there's the mention of the being 7 years. Time flies, but first I should say I haven't been on the EMAC, the committee itself, except for the past month or whatever, but I regularly attend these meetings and I'm very aware of what's going on. And my reason for being involved with all of this is because my team is somewhat responsible for connectivity on a statewide level for Arizona Game and Fish Department. So we do this kind of stuff in a lot of places. So EMAC was a unique situation that like was mentioned, I mentioned a couple times, it's a more proactive approach in some areas. And so it's neat to see some of this stuff happening. That said, going back to the 7-year comment, is it feels like, just based on the way that some of the transportation projects move, it feels like this committee's barely had a chance to even get rolling because, the example was the 69 culvert, which, we had an opportunity to look at that and say, here's what needs to be done. Well, it was too late. If EMAC had been 15 years ago, we might have been able to do something. So some of these projects that are coming up, we do have more opportunity. I see Sundog is a little bit better of an opportunity, but I still feel like it's a little bit behind. I just have this vibe of collecting data for it still feels a little bit rushed. So having some of the data in advance would be great. And as far as Justin mentioned some of the models, would be an Arizona Wildlife Linkage Assessment, which I was part of back in the mid-2000s. I was able to help with some of that. And that particular model is really broad brush. It's a giant chunks on a map where it just brings us together to talk about it. You can't really use it to make fine scale decisions on. You're not going to be able to use it for the Sundog connector. All you know is these are the species in the area. These are some of the concerns. This is very large scale. The countywide maps are also pretty broad scale, but it just starts to narrow it down a little bit. And so one of the things that's important to note is some of the studies that like the wildlife movement studies, for example, those are data driven, where some of these models are more expert opinion that sometimes is right, sometimes is wrong. We're doing the best we can. But when you show, in case of working with ADOT, when you lay down a map that shows animals cross here or animals get killed here, okay, yeah, we know do something rather than, JD sees deer cross by our house every day. That doesn't carry as much weight as the data. So having the data is important in that case. And so I think one of the things that's obviously behind getting the data comes the funding. We talked about getting grants and stuff like that. An important concept that is something to keep in mind. In some of the projects I've worked on with ADOT on design concept reports or EISs, they've actually provided the funding from the project funds to allow us to go gather the information to help inform those projects. And I think, sometimes we can go leverage that and get more funds if we need to, but being able to use those funds to gather that information, it's just like if ADOT is going to do a geotechnical study or traffic study, there also should be a wildlife study. For some reason that gets a pushback, but they'll update the traffic studies 15 times over the next 20 years. And when you try to do one wildlife study, it's like, you need to go find some funding, And so working with ADOT on some of the other projects we've been able to get that funding to help guide the project, and it's been very, very useful in those regards. One of the things, thinking more large scale, we look at some of these projects like Sundog, for example, and we kind of look at it in a little bit of a small scale in a way, and really getting that larger scale connectivity feel, I think, is really important, backing up quite a bit. And that's where like Francisco comes into play. We've got a pronghorn herd that travels from Flagstaff to Prescott every year. And I work with him on doing habitat improvements to help get those pronghorn here Prescott every year. Well, they come into the CYMPO boundary, and it's important that we think about how they move through here. And so stepping back on some of this also, I think, is important, really getting that larger scale.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Just since you made a specific example, I'm curious, is there any kind, so for example, as a consultant that also does transportation, sorry, I'll stand over here.
We should have had a mic on her. This is very
I
frustrating.
feel like
Katie,
I'm
do you
loud,
wanna
I'm
sit over
sorry.
here?
You wanna-
You wanna sit over here?
You wanna
Yeah.
sit
I
up
can
closer?
switch
Forward.
also. I
Can't
can't.
hear you then.
It might just be the acoustics. of the
I'm
room.
usually, like, people tell me I'm loud, so I try not to scream at
My hands
everyone.
are on and stuff, so.
Oh, okay,
This
sorry.
room is not, it's echo, the other room is easier to hear people, so.
So does Game and Fish have a repository or a resource where consultants could look to know, okay, this is where the pronghorn movement occurs, because you are both aware. So is that something that's documented that would be a resource available?
In some instances, some of it's still being collected, and we're sensitive about some of the data that's currently being collected. But in an instance where, say, we were looking at pronghorn traveling into the EMAC area, I'm sure we could figure something out in those regards to be able to help inform decisions for projects. A lot of times we need data sharing agreements. And so whether we need that here or not, I can't answer that question. But I mean, whenever, like I shared a map with Allison the other day, I don't know, it was that map, that exact map was the pronghorn movements into this area. So I thought it would be important for this group to have that context, that larger scale context, and thinking a little bit large landscape scale in those instances. And so I think and JD saying pronghorn aren't the only ones we need to consider. Yes, and that's where it gets down to the local versus large scale. When you get down to the local, for example, I'm going to use Sundog Connector for an example, is we've got local wildlife that move through those communities and will be affected by the sundog one way or another. So trying to address that is important. But then you get larger scale, we've got a migrating deer herd that crosses at 69 and gets hit quite a bit, along with a bunch of other wildlife that will also be connected, as part of this larger connectivity, they'll be affected by the sundog too. So we need to think about that in both kind of directions, I guess you'd say. I think I got most of my scattered notes. So.
Sure. Well, I'm just gonna ask a few questions, and I guess I'll ask them in both directions. So with what you were saying, what I heard was that you're kind of echoing to the need for additional data review, resource review within the project development process early on to identify needs and maybe mitigating measures. And then what I heard and was excited about, and maybe you are as well, is that there may be an opportunity, and I don't know if it's within the Game and Fish purview, that there could be some development of additional data sources within the region to help provide that information earlier in the process.
There can, but a lot of that data isn't there either. Some of it can be either too large scale, some of it would be potentially old. And so there's a lot of gaps in the data. And so when you take, say for example, you take the little bit of data we have and try to apply it across the CYMPO to make your planning, and if you have a lot of gaps, it can be misleading.
Sure.
And so having robust data is important. And in some cases, we don't have robust data in order to make the decisions that we need to for some of these projects. And so, just because we've got one animal that does this, and I say, here's the data from this one animal that does this.
It could be an anomaly.
It could be. And so it's just being real careful with that. And I don't feel like for, this particular area, I feel like whether it's using project funding or getting funds elsewhere and bringing in, or all of the above, I think there needs to be more data collected to help inform some of these processes, and the sooner the better, because we wouldn't have these conversations we have about what's the, where do we need to put the wildlife crossings or the fencing, and some of this stuff we can kind of get at because, we have done enough of it to understand, but in a lot of cases, really you feel more comfortable when you have data-driven recommendations.
Of course. And then for those of us that don't know, just to have context, let's say there was a desire to have more data, what kind of a time frame? How much time does it take to even to develop the data?
Depends on what you're doing. So for example, we like to do wildlife movement studies.
Mhm.
Collar deer, not elk here necessarily, but elk, deer, pronghorn, kind of where it is. Various wildlife, kind of umbrella species to some degree, but you can also get down in some of the smaller animals. In some areas, we do tortoise movement studies, it just depends on what you're looking at. And so I typically recommend 2 to 3 years. And that is because you get seasonal changes. Like you collar an animal this year, these animals we don't get the same kind of precipitation or whatever it may be. They don't do what they would normally do. So getting the seasonal variation. And so the batteries on a lot of those collars last, 2 to 3 years, sometimes 4. And, it gives us not only the recommendations, but it gives us this baseline data to wonder to see how good we did later on. So if you say this is our recommendation, and then we this is the data that these animals are moving through here. Now we make our recommendations. Are those animals still moving through it? Did we make the right decisions? Because a lot of this urban development, wildlife movements is super tricky. It's not, aside from Prescott, one of the biggest places I've worked with is the Tucson area. They've really taken on wildlife, and they were learning a lot from it, but they're also, because they have a funding source for this kind of stuff, we're able to gather a lot more.
What is their funding source?
They tax themselves. This does Coconino County.
What's that, Jenny?
They tax themselves. They have a specific line item that goes in, so they have a reliable, constant source of money that they can use for overpasses and mitigation. I would just like to start out by saying that I appreciate Vinnie's acknowledgement of my effort in this. However, there are 2 gentlemen out of the 3 in this room right now who educated me, who encouraged me, and one of them is Jeff, and I thank you and Scott for having taught me so much. The other one is Chuck Bunninger, who is equally as passionate as I am in terms of the fact that we have to do something to protect our wildlife. Interestingly, you mentioned Tucson. Tucson has, I think, 2 overpasses. I know they at least have 1 with the money that they have taxed themselves to raise. Coconino County, and this is something that's very frustrating. I learned this on Facebook, not from any information that was generated somewhere else, that Coconino County, they're working on 2 or 3 overpasses in the 7 years that we have been talking about what needs to be done here. And basically nothing has been done except that we've identified the problem. Now, again, Coconino County has a tax that they tax themselves, so they can use that money. But it just is, at the planning meeting for the city of Prescott, I told several people, I'm living in the wrong county, because we've been talking about this need for 7 years. 2 other counties have done something about it, and there hasn't even been anyone who has brought up the idea that, gee, maybe we should go to the public, explain what 2 other counties are doing so that we can have the money to make a difference. When Chuck and I first met with Jeff, he told me that essentially we're going to lose the pronghorn in this area. The Prairie Garland or Garland Prairie, you said up near I-40 was going to be an area where we may be able to set up something and save them up there. Last week, there was a presentation, and I'm sorry, Vinny, if I'm getting off track, but you know me, I get on a roll, regarding the possibility that there may be a state park established at Del Rio Springs. And that's being looked at by the county, the owners, by the Trust for Public Land. And one of the things is I said, well, can't,
In the town of Chino Valley.
and the town of Chino Valley, because it's in Chino Valley.
Yep.
So I mean, this is a tremendous thing for me, and I'm sorry for those of you who want to say the Dells, but I'm almost more in love with the Del Rio Springs. And so I asked a question, can we relocate some of our pronghorn up there? And Supervisor Brown, whose area that is, indicated that there are about 50 up there. And then if we tried to relocate some, that there wouldn't be enough food. But what you're saying is that those pronghorn, that's just a drop in the bucket, that if they come all the way from Flagstaff down to Prescott and go, I knew they did a migration, but that's fantastic. So, I mean, we're getting educated in bits and pieces. When we were, one of the commitments that we had made to the executive committee is that we would try to obtain funding for some of the mitigation.
Okay.
Now, I've never written a grant. I know that it takes a lot of skill to write one. I'm willing to work on it on pieces if I get training on how to do it, or if we hire someone who comes in and needs some additional help. Money seems to speak. The other thing that is frustrating for me at this time, we're talking about the Sundog connector as if it's a done deal. I've had somebody tell me that in my lifetime, it's not going to be built. There's no funding for it. There's a lot of opposition to it. I could see where getting some of the information about the, but if we do it for the whole CYMPO area, it takes in more than just Sundog. We still have a freight corridor in the state, Route 69.
Yes.
There's still deer that are dying on 69, so we haven't gotten that information, but that needs to be brought in. So
Let me
it's,
ask.
yes.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like what I'm hearing from you is you need more information earlier, and you sense there is a need for some type of funding source.
Absolutely.
And then let me ask, kind of more, rather than the larger big picture, what's happening, but what do you see within the context of this group, CYMPO, regional transportation? Do you see, like I say, you mentioned two, what I would call potentially actionable items. Are there, and I understand you have a lot of concerns, but looking towards what type of action would you like to see? Do you think maybe attainable?
Well, there's several things. Thank goodness for Jeff that if he's saying, and he said it at the last meeting we had, that to do a significant study takes a couple of years. So we need to make that a priority and get that going now, whatever it takes. And the other thing is, I know that Game and Fish, a lot of people don't realize that they don't get allotments of state funds. All of their funding comes from the sale of like hunting license and whatever. So just like people don't realize that ADOT doesn't have a deep purse. And for a while, the Department of Public Safety was taking a lot of what they did get out. So there's a lot that the public doesn't realize. They're very quick to criticize what both of those state agencies do. And I know what that feels like because I used to work for one that got even more attacks. But at any rate, I think there needs to be a lot of public education, because we have a group, we have a few of them sitting here today, and they represent not just the two people who were here, but they represent probably at least 200 other people in the community who care about what the mission of this committee is.
So additional public, sorry, like I said, looking for some actionable items. So I heard additional public information related to.
That will help generate funding, because if we get people behind what our mission is, they're going to help us figure out how to do the funding. And then we need some instruction, either that or some money allocated for a grant writer, so that we can begin, exploring and getting the money. And then just down to what's happening just on the formation of this committee. you know, initially we had 7 members. Then we had one of the privates, and with the 4, is that right? And the 4 that are, yeah, because there's 7, so there's 4 that represent agencies. There's nothing that needs to be done because each of the agencies sends whom they want as their representative. But with the 3 private citizens, it hasn't been a structure set up yet. And when the first private person left, another person was selected. And our committee had absolutely no input as to the selection process. So we absolutely need to have a selection process for the private citizen positions on this, because I've gotten feedback that there are people, sorry, Benny, who are also as passionate as I am in the community, who would like to serve on this committee. And I don't know what has happened if you don't want another me on the committee, that you know, that we needed to clarify how those positions are, what the criteria are, and we have to include this committee in at least part of the screening process in this election. And I just learned just now, see, and again, there's the big global work that we're doing, that we want to do. But there's also the nuts and bolts of this committee that hasn't really been ironed out. I didn't know that we were going to have an annual rotation for a TAC member. I just learned that just today.
So you would like more structured bylaws and guidance, which we will be providing as a part of this. I heard you mention before, you know, what if you don't want to be on the committee? What do you do? If you want to do this, what do you do? So it sounds like some general information related to how the committee is formed, structured, roles of TAC, etc., would be helpful.
And the other thing too, and again, because for a while I was on the board for conservation easements. And so I'm very much aware, and that was part of the problem with the underpass at State Route 69, is that if you're going to have corridors for this wildlife, they have to be permanently maintained through something like intergovernmental agreements or conservation easements or leasing for 20, 30 years, because you can't get them over under 69 and then have a dead end because they run into a commercial parking lot. Now, what I have learned over the years, and actually because in my neighborhood, 10, 15 feet between houses, the deer feel very comfortable going through it. So it doesn't have to be huge.
Yeah.
The other thing too is that I think we have to work with the member towns and cities, this committee, to take a look, and Tammy's heard me going off on this quite a while. And the general plan is now looking at that, as we had a county general plan, and now we're having the Prescott. Their recommendations regarding wildlife corridors and open space requirements, but they aren't part of the land use code of the member agencies or the cities. And so I think that that's something else that this committee can help lobby for and educate the public that there are huge things we need to do in terms of agreements and open space for animals. And it's not just the pronghorn and the deer. I remember when we first started out, there was a badger that was killed on 89 up near Chino Valley, right around one of the roundabouts. You know, badgers are one of the hallmarks for the high school here. So it just, there's a wide range, and there's so much to do. And we need to get it structured and start working on, you know, identifying the priorities of where we start with.
I've got a few actionable things, or potentially actionable. So that's helpful. Tammy.
So I was asked, when this group was formed, I was asked to be on it. I was a county planner at the time. So I have a regional concept of what's going on for planning and zoning purposes and property rights and things like that, and what we can and can't do as jurisdictions. So this actually was updated to from Yavapai County land use to, I forgot how we labeled it in 19, when I went to the city of Prescott, to allow me to continue being on this committee. Because I have regional knowledge of everything. So I bring to the table from the city's jurisdiction or from planning, you know, what we as jurisdictions in regards to planning processes, what we can and cannot do. So that's kind of my role, is to keep that in play, which she doesn't like, but the reality of it, you know, of what we can and cannot do statutorily, or, you know, private property rights, you know,
Right.
because Arizona is
important.
very big in
Yes.
private property rights, and, you know, we have to take that always into consideration. So that's
So you provide a lens of feasibility, you would say.
tried, yeah.
Okay.
But I was also involved as a county planner in all those wildlife studies too, in 2007 or 6, that one. And then the other one that they did more recently, I was the county staff person involved in that.
Okay.
So I have a lot of knowledge about the wildlife stuff and trail planning. I did that for the county, and now with the city of Prescott, it's a little bit more, but I still keep an eye on what's going on regionally.
Okay. And then just to ask, how much time do you have outside of these meetings to devote to the EMAC responsibilities?
Well, if you look at our planning staff, it's 1.5 planners and a planning manager. That's our staff. And we are doing the general plan update internally. Me. How much time do I have?
Zero. Okay.
In reality, I mean, I try as much as I can. I mean, I try to meet with them when I need to and stuff. I make it happen, but only when I'm tasked with looking at something can I do it. I don't think about it outside, except looking at the general plan, what we can incorporate into it for a city. You know, which is a lot different than the county. County, big state, larger than states, you know, Yavapai County, 3,500 square miles, a little bit different animal than the city, you know, so, but we had that data, I mean, for the county, the wildlife and just information, we had those GIS links, and I used to look at it when big projects came in to see what options, or if it's going to affect anything that we had. So, but as a city, we don't have that data, which would be good to have, you know, something, but I know that it's still being formed, so.
So then what I'm hearing is you have availability as an advisory role and your participation here, and on request, potentially outside of here, you provide the lens for kind of what's feasible versus what's not. You're familiar with all of the wildlife intelligence studies, you've been involved in those. But as far as the tasks on the list go, maybe not a lot of bandwidth.
Correct.
So as part of an action thing, maybe we can explore funding for as a specific CYMPO staff member to follow up on some of the things that we identified as needing more information and funding.
Well, Vinny, I'm back to you now. So I'm not standing over there, so I'm not advancing the slide. But, you know, I think we've heard from the EMAC kind of where they can provide information, the information that they can provide, the bandwidth that they can provide, and kind of an assessment of their ability to provide services within the original 7 years ago scope for the group. That said, and I'm not putting you on the spot, you're absolutely allowed to pause, give thought, get back to me, because that's what I'm here for. But is there anything from a dialogue perspective that hearing all of this has prompted you, in the context of today, what do you think is a meaningful, beneficial, or would you like to vet as a meaningful, beneficial input you can get from the EMAC to help advance the priorities of CYMPO?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think there's several comments to follow up on there. I'm not gonna by no means address them all, but I would say the spirit of all of it, I think there's an incredible awareness on staff's end. And I'll pick on Deb for a minute. You know, when staff has kind of those same questions and concerns, we're kind of maybe struggling of like, well, how long are terms? How do you fill a position? Who reviews that? And you kind of look back to the forefathers that created this and said, all right, what were they thinking? They kind of didn't set us up for the best success. And here we are kind of clunking along 7 years later. And we want that clarity. Staff wants that, the committee wants that. When you don't have that, you kind of get to this point of scratching heads and some irritation on all sides. So I think that's something I definitely heard. That was a major reason for me offering the idea to the executive board, getting the TAC to buy into the idea, support it, say, hey, we need some extra help here. And you're standing here doing just that. So I think that's number one. I would like to probably go back to the last Sundog meeting where I really was able to take away some things, and I'll focus on Jeff's point. And I think we've probably brought that into this meeting. Deb added to it and a few others added to it. I, as a planner, have been really chewing on what does that look like for CYMPO to pick up that conversation and carry that torch to some degree of being able to identify funds, create priorities that update wildlife migration patterns. I really started to see in that conversation an opportunity to fit within CYMPO funding and priorities. Now, as I say that, on any given thing, and I laid the groundwork here, staff, this committee can come up with those best ideas, then it becomes critical to my role of what does that minefield look like moving forward? What does it look like for Frank and I to take that conversation to the TAC? How do we incorporate it in there, realizing that those TAC members have their elected official representation, and that's ultimately where we're working to. So how does that fit in with the greater philosophical political vision? So again, not that there's not a desire to do it, but how do we advance something with success? So I will say from a very practical standpoint, I think that sticks out, that I think there's incredible potential for movement there. I think those are some very practical, reasonable things to put on the table. And I think maybe a third and final point I'll try and make, and you can ask a follow-up question if you want. And I think Jeff hit on this. It is incredibly fascinating, the length of time on any given transportation project. The Sundog connector is at the 25-year mark. Somebody has to look in that crystal ball. When could it possibly be done? And again, we're on the front lines evaluating that, looking at that. We don't have a gauge. JD identified there's no construction funding for it. We're doing the planning process. But again, in 25 years, the two bookends have been identified, but nothing more than that. So kind of to Jeff's point, are we early on? I think so. Are we a little too late? Maybe. You look at Highway 69 as a specific project that Francisco identified and a few others identified. That is coming up on the 10-year mark of a 10-year conversation from the real concentrated effort to have leaders in the community from a political level really step up and advocate for that project to where we are today. And they're looking at construction, I think, beginning just after the first of the year, and that's going to go 11, 12 years. So on any given project, there's some serious time that takes place. I'm committed to have this committee in as early as possible. And when we look at new regional roadway projects, in all honesty, let's be very, very clear. To the best of my knowledge, there's only two on the book. It's the Sundog Connector and it's the Great Western. That's it as far as new roadways go. Anything else that I'm aware of from a regional transportation is working with what's already there. So if we're being incredibly practical, and I think we're getting there more and more, Great Western has a price tag to connect Prescott Valley and Prescott around $300 million.
Probably more.
Okay, let's use the 69.
Everything is more by now.
Yeah, let's use the 69 project. That's a $13 million project, of which the locals contributed $2 million, ADOT $11 million. So just use that in context. We've been able to deliver that 69 project. 300 million is just not a thing. So you kind of, the only thing left as far as a new roadway goes is where the Sundog comes into that conversation. Again, reminder, this is always going to go back to those that we elect to make that ultimate decision. Whatever our plan says, the electeds of Prescott and the surrounding communities will make those decisions. Can EMAC add a voice to it? Absolutely. Can they contribute a voice and say, look, if this road ever happens, here are some ways to absolutely look at projects within this corridor that will be, that'll advocate and do the best to protect the environment and the wildlife. I think those are my major points, but go for it.
And I think too, well, one second. You both indicated that's something that you would be able to do, correct? Is identify mitigating measures once the project context is more specific. So would that fit within the role of things you're able to do?
That's a broad question. I mean, like, I think
That's
really you
fair.
have to see, it's kind of a case by case basis on what kind of information you have
Okay,
at the time. So if we have like an example would be if we have an area that's a new road, if we have the data we need, we can say, yeah, here's where we need to do this. And because we've learned from these species, here's what we need to do, we can get there. And that's what I tend to do for a lot of projects I work on. But just I think it's,
And from my point of view, yeah, saying what Jeff said, but then also sometimes we know we don't have the information or we're not going to have the time to do it. So we have general guidelines.
and
Yeah,
best practices.
exactly.
And is that something that would be fair and reasonable to offer for project development and for information? Because Sue, I would suggest or infer having some best practices maybe in hand or provided would be something that EMAC could offer, even in the context of, let's say, Sundog, to say, okay, we're aware of this project. We're aware, even though we don't have perfect information, we have some information. We can offer some mitigating strategies to consider, because the earlier you fold it into the project, the better your project development process is, the better your cost estimates are, the better. And it also, as much as anything else, if at this stage, those types of things were identified, they might advance with the project development process.
and we did the Sundog meeting that we had last time. That was a discussion. It's like, if we, right now, this is what we know. Let's overestimate and put these culverts here with these potential designs so we can move forward with something. And maybe by the time to gather some more information as the project develops. So that's something that, yeah, when it's too late, you got to do the best you can. And this may not be too late, but the example I gave in working with ADOT on other projects is this is a strategy that works. If we do the best we can now, and then we get information along the way that helps either change it or keep it, then that's, at least we have
Right.
flexibility.
Right, because if you planned for larger culverts now for wildlife crossings, you could shift them or whatever the case may be as the time approached.
One other thing, and for lack of a couple of weeks, our ADOT environmental specialist is now sitting at this table where I wish he was. But the thing to keep in mind is that, to my knowledge, this is the only, or at most one of the few committees where you have the major players in wildlife sitting at the same table. And Francisco may not be able to do what he needs himself, but he's tied into a whole
Agency, yes.
department, and he can tap into that and bring information back, as can Jeff
Yes.
or the other representative from the district office. The other, so it's really, really important that since we have this expertise,
To leverage it.
that we take advantage of it. And the other thing too is that I'm wondering, do we need to limit it just to these huge, big projects? Or, there's the city of Prescott with the widening of 89 going through the Dells. Bringing information about how that would impact wildlife there, or other things, there are a lot of, I remember the first meeting that I attended way back for the 2040. And you said, or it may have been Chris, that by 2040, all of the 2-lane highways in this area would be 6-lane highways. So can we figure out a way that we can come and give wildlife mitigation information to more than just these big new places, but to expansion of existing roads?
I guess an initial response to, and I'll think that through more, JD. We need a good reminder when you think of CYMPO, very often, depending on the community, can identify CYMPO as this thing that's unique and kind of in a bubble. And I try and shatter that by saying that CYMPO is the local government. CYMPO is Prescott. It is the Prescott Valley government. It's the Chino Valley government. So, you know, like if you take Sundog as an example, they want to kind of put CYMPO here and the city of Prescott here and kind of put us at odds. And in reality, we're not. I can't remind you enough. Again, the executive board that I serve, again, places the region as a whole. So really going to your point, JD, you know, could you speak to these other things? Those are valid suggestions to bring through the TAC and the executive board and say, look, right now, this committee remains somewhat focused on very specific projects that are in the spreadsheet of CYMPO, but obviously these other things are happening, and could that voice be added to it? So I think it's a reasonable ask, and I think in a healthy organization, you can advance that type of communication because Prescott's part of CYMPO. So yes.
I have something.
You looked like you're about to speak.
Because both of them are onto something here that I wanted to bring up is, Vinny, you mentioned that the 2 main roads is the Sundog and the Great Western Extension, but some of these existing roads, I mean, a lot of the projects I work on with the DOTs, 90% of them are existing roads. And we have opportunities when these existing roads are upgraded to make them wildlife friendly. And so it's like and in fact, like I've seen where roads have gone from 2-lane to 4-lane, it actually is a benefit to wildlife because we've addressed it through mitigation. Whereas that original 2-lane road was, you know, animals were getting killed, or habitat fragmentation. In some instances, these upgrades, they're a benefit, they're a win-win if they're handled properly. So when we were talking about trying to about the data for these existing roads, you know, the wildlife movement studies help those. We do roadkill studies. We do culvert monitoring with cameras, what's coming up to these and what, you know, which culverts are the best ones. So that was getting back to the big picture of how we take the existing roads and these new roads and think of it at a larger scale. So definitely don't want to focus on the new roads because we're missing a great opportunity.
And if I can just, I think you're both absolutely in the same spirit. Just for clarification, you know, I think, you know, Jeff is saying, well, you know, maybe projects within the CYMPO region that CYMPO is working on is sort of what I'm hearing. And then JD is saying, well, there's projects within the region that aren't necessarily a CYMPO management. And I would say yes to both of them. I would. And the examples that I would give you, Jeff, you know, we're looking for money on Highway 89 out in Frank's area in Chino Valley between 3 and 5 north. It's currently 1 lane in both directions. With the state's help in the next year, fingers crossed, we're going to make that 2 lanes in both directions. You know, I think that's about a 2-mile segment. So again, is there an opportunity? Possibly, yes. One other quick example I would give you would be, we're going to be looking at State Route 89A at the base of Mingus Mountain in the town of Prescott Valley from the intersection with Robert Road going to the Forest Service boundary. It's an 8-mile segment. Again, we're going to be evaluating that for safety purposes, but I would open that up to EMAC. I would open up to you specifically. And as that corridor is being evaluated in 5 years, there's been 65 crashes, 3 fatalities. That's going to be leading the discussion. But as we look to remedy that corridor, to your point, Jeff, what additional things could be enhanced in that area? And absolutely, we would open all projects that CYMPO is working on, but those are a couple to support your example.
Well, in that the migration of that phone herd from Flagstaff down here, both of those herds cross both of those roads, and if those become 4 lane without mitigating the barrier for those animals, it'll become complete fragmentation. So it's definitely a conversation.
We'd welcome the voice of EMAC and you specifically to that. How'd I do with your questions? Okay.
Great.
Do you have any
Actually,
more for me or are we good?
And I know this is a study session, but I mean, I want to do more than just talk about that. Is there some means by way that we can make a motion that the TAC then can take it to the executive board and put it on the agenda that we would be able to look at these kind of additional expansions and do the mitigation? Because that, I mean, for this committee to still be in existence and they're still not being educated, meaningful mitigation, where we know that it's right smack dab in a corridor.
The action, JD, to your comment or your question will be the work that Burgess and Nyepel does on your behalf and on our behalf. Dana is listening to this. She's going to compile it. She's going to be back in a month and then another month to give the exact summary to what you said. And she's going to give you that chance to review what you said today and say, all right, here's what I heard from CYMPO staff, EMAC, and everyone. And she's putting it in a 3-month process to do exactly what you said. So that's the action.
Yes, so we're not gonna, this is a study session and I don't believe it was posted on the public website as a meeting with, so we're not gonna do a formal action for.
So we have to wait till an actual
You,
meeting to make that motion, then to take it to TAC and TAC then take it.
But we
to
are-
executive board. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you, we are working on, that was the point of today, is to find out what it is, again, this group is able to do and passionate about doing, and how that can fit in best with CYMPO's charge. So I think the dialogue we've had is really productive. I hope you all agree.
Well,
Okay,
as long as we're looking at procedures, and again, it was set up that this committee answered to the TAC and then the TAC
Yes.
goes on. But what if we really feel so strongly about something and the TAC says, we don't want to do that. We don't want to take that forward. If we're looking at procedural things, I would recommend that if there was something that we thought that was really, really super important and TAC didn't feel comfortable taking it forward, that we be allowed to present to the executive committee from the EMAC.
Is this where I
Sorry,
step up?
almost an exception.
I hate to,
To burst my bubble.
yeah, but the way this committee was set up was to advise the TAC, much like the TAC advises the executive board. So that's like saying, let's go over their head if we don't like they're
Well,
doing.
if it-
Well,
you know, and-
let me finish. I know you're passionate, but let me finish. It's much like if the TAC doesn't like what the executive board says, trying to do something over their head, you can't really do that the way these committees are structured, at least in my opinion, because the TAC is there to serve the executive board. So, and this committee was set up to advise the TAC.
Well, that's the way that's the way that it wound up being, but initially there was discussion that we would be a parallel committee, that we
Okay.
would, that we wouldn't,
But
but
did the executive board set it up that way?
well, and let me offer an outside perspective. I would say, not knowing, how it would play out for any one thing, but, if you want to maintain a positive working relationship with your TAC, which I would think that you would, generally speaking, people don't love it when you go around them. So I would suggest that you try to engage them and find alignment, and maybe kind of like what we're doing today, where maybe they don't want to broach something the exact same way that you would want to broach it, but there's a way that you could approach something that they would support and would want to advance, because if they're championing it too, it's more likely to progress.
actually, because we've had a very good relationship with the TAC, and you
wanna
guys have
protect
been you were very supportive, WAC, when this committee was established, so. And
Yeah.
it would help you in some projects, I would think.
Well, yeah, and I don't know that you would ever have the case where the TAC would try and stifle the
So-
EMAC committee and not at least
Yeah,
let the executive board know the discussion was had. If they have a slightly different recommendation, I think Vinny, as part of his job, would make sure that the board knows what the opinion of the EMAC was and maybe why the TAC, if there was a slightly different route they took,
why?
but
Mhm.
in his staff reports and other documentation and presentations would make sure the executive board knew what conversations were had.
I would,
So they have all the information.
right, I would think so too. And also consider, if the TAC did want to refine the initial approach suggested, it might be due to interagency constraints or, kind of what you said about you're here and you can provide the realm of feasible versus infeasible. So the TAC may try to align with what is feasible, which would be a benefit.
But that makes it even more important that somehow we be enabled to look for other funding, because if you had some great ideas
Yep.
on some roads are gonna be expanded and the TAC and the cities or the member didn't have the money, that we could maybe, figure out a way to get it.
Yeah,
so that
that's
the mitigation.
Well,
can
and-
occur.
much like 69, the TAC was in favor,
Yeah,
from my understanding of maybe wildlife crossings. The problem was ADOT was coming back, said if you try and put this in, it'll kill the project.
Right, well, and that's one thing where, and again, I think the conversation was helpful, because CYMPO also was looking for funding and thus the charge of grant writing. But now, I'd say grant writing is a significant lift. I've done it as a consultant. It's not something that you can just kind of piece together in your spare time.
right.
So understanding that maybe there are other avenues that would be pursued to look for some of those funds. And that's kind of some of the benefit of.
But that means that the EMAC committee needs to, if there are 2 roads now that are gonna be going out to 4 lanes or whatever, we need to know about that really early, so we can get game and fish, and of course, if it's gonna impact, and it's certainly if it's gonna impact the town. We need to know so we can try and figure out how to get the money there for it.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, I think maybe the spirit of Frank's comment, again, staff is in no way looking to stifle this committee. Ours is to literally look at the landscape of the area and try and figure out how do we advance anything. And again, it's always funding and politics, right? So if you bring a project forward, I'm like, okay, well, I think we can do it, but what's the maneuver to get that done? So all that to say, we work side by side with the TAC. The TAC, we don't work for the TAC, but we work next to them with them. We're both making recommendations. I'm the executive director taking in EMAC, the TAC, and all of that. Again, not trying to hide anything, but say, all right, I know these 6 political personalities and how do we get something done? So all that to say, absolutely, we welcome all of that. That's a part of it. And yeah, we're on board.
Maybe what we can do, if it's within a certain jurisdiction that invite the TAC member, the public works director, whatever, along with the executive board member, and to come to an orientation with, a sit down with EMAC, that we could present what we see as potential mitigation that could be done and discuss it, with them in person. I mean, it's one thing to go to an executive board meeting, and it's one thing to go to a TAC, but actually sit down and explain what we see is potentially needed.
And I think, you all have brought up the 69 project multiple times, and I think it is a great example. And I think we've talked about the time aspects, maybe getting a little bit behind it. Frank just brought up the fiscal part. And again, that's on any project. Some of you might have better numbers than I do, but again, you're looking at a $13 million project. If I remember right, that wildlife overpass was somewhere around 10 million or so, but maybe that's a little bit on the high end. Either way, to Frank's point, there's some decisions that have to be made. If you got this limited funds on any given project, how are those decision makers making it? So, that's the ultimate project. But again, as Jeff alluded to, there were compromises on the underpass. Is it perfect? No. But I would argue on any project, I think that's our success of how do we work together with what we have.
But we could have a range of mitigation
Mhm.
from overpass, underpass to flashing lights, which we know aren't all that wonderful. But maybe if it's gonna go 2 lane to 4 lane, if there's a median that the wildlife could, I don't know how it worked out on that one, that it was actually safer for them being a 4 lane than a 2 lane, but if Game and Fish has the means and ADOT, their new environmental person, has suggestions on how some of this can be, tweaked a bit to make it safer for wildlife, it may not cost the millions.
And just again, a reminder, JD, Dana and her team are gonna come up with that menu of projects prioritized. That's gonna cover the whole range from the signage to the overpass. And they're gonna work with you, with the TAC, with staff to come up with that very specific priority list. So that'll be part of the outcome.
Can I make a couple more comments?
Sure, we
I'll
are up against it.
Try and be
timelines, but
brief.
Yeah,
But just for example, one concrete example I'm looking to do, it's almost the reverse of what you're talking about, JD. Is for example, we've got a project, we're working on the Granite Creek crossing at Perkinsville Road, east of town. It's a gravel road, but it's right in antelope country or pronghorn country, speed goat, whatever you want to call them. But we're working with county flood control, and right now we've got a feasibility grant to look at upgrading that crossing to a permanent all-weather type crossing. But a major component of that is going to be the wildlife aspect of it, and maybe incorporating a wildlife crossing into Perkinsville Road, because there's a concrete plant and gravel pit right there too. A lot of truck traffic. So from town of Chino Valley's perspective, I'm probably going to come to this committee and ask the committee to recommend through the TAC to the executive board that letters of support and input on projects like that. So in my mind, I see this as another
That's wonderful.
scope for this committee as a resource for some of the member agencies of CYMPO to utilize to help with those grants and other things and get that support, much like letters of support from Fish and Game.
Yeah, I've written that down too, because what I do know about grants is if you show widespread support with different entities, it has better chance of getting.
And the other comment I wanted to make is, I know wildlife is a major focus, but if you look at the purpose statement, it also includes mitigation for natural resources.
yes.
And in my mind, natural resources are not only wildlife, but they're air, soil, and water as well.
Right.
So, and it leads into some of the carbon reduction, air quality, water quality, minerals,
Right.
that sort of thing too. So it can get really broad if you.
Yes, well, and that
Go that
was
way.
a point that Vinny had made was, again, the direction that this group has gone, in juxtaposition to the original charge 7 years ago, because to your point, 7 years ago, the idea was, let's be a steward of natural resources, but it's become very wildlife focused. So kind of as a general question to the group, is that the charge, or is the charge broader natural resources?
With water,
Or maybe
the
you can
animals
tap
go
into
along
both.
water corridors, so
then-
they kind of are together.
You might be able to tap into 2 different funding sources.
Potentially, yeah. So,
Because I mean, I know in the Phoenix area, for example, with PM10, the air quality is
Right.
huge. It's a matter of time before it happens here.
Around cement plants,
Mhm.
though, that's a consideration
Yeah.
because of what, so that right there, you
And,
have that.
Well, and water
Drake right
quality
there,
as
yeah.
well,
right,
with all of the operations, and even with roads and the runoff from the streets and everything.
right.
Water quality should be a consideration in some of these project scopes as well.
Would it be permissible? Of course, I know as a private citizen, I could do it, but you're gonna have to go in front of your city council and ask for money and whatever. And would it be helpful? I mean, you could get something in writing, but would it also be helpful to have some of us come in and support you?
Well, it depends on the project, and we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I'd probably consult with Vinny and my, our executive board representation, elected officials and see, depending on the project, the strategy we need there. Because a lot of time the support would be more for the federal reviewers. For this one is an EPA grant, so it would be not so much. Our town council's very much in favor of it. So asking for support from the council when you already have it might not be good. It's more the written documentation, but on another project, it may help to come talk to the council and get the point of view from the entire CYMPO region as far as the environmental view of it.
But if you're listing the things that we could provide, even if
Frank, do you have a copy of that pronghorn map that I was telling you about, or the pronghorn data that I've been talking about for the herd that migrates from Flagstaff?
I don't, I think I remember seeing it at the next
Okay,
meeting.
because it goes through a couple areas you've been talking about today. It's important. to have it.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
would
they're,
be helpful for your application.
the pronghorn's on our town logo, so.
Jeff, did you say you sent that to Allison?
I did send it out.
Allison, you can share it with the group. Yeah, she'll forward it to you.
Well,
And we're years away from anything on
That's
that
fine.
project.
That's still-
so
that's still
We're
good.
just at feasibility right now.
right,
so,
but if
information.
you're applying for a grant, to the
Yeah.
EPA, that's something that, hey, we got this, we know it.
Yeah, so we actually got the feasibility
We got it.
portion of it.
Okay. They said we're applying.
Well, so the next grant will be the actual starting the design, but
But it's
Yeah.
good, it's good that you're years away because you can look at some of this information.
yeah, it's the perfect timing to
Yeah.
keep that into it. And actually, the EPA was the one that said any wildlife criteria you can put into it would help your cause, so.
Well, and this, again, this seems like it might be a good platform to your, for the CYMPO members to be able to come and ask guidance resources, or hey, is there something you're aware of? We're doing this, can you help us? And that sounds like something you guys are willing and able to do.
Yeah, so I'm gonna, trust me, I'm not scared to ask, so.
Well, that Perkinsville example is a good example of the larger scale I'm talking about.
Mhm.
You make one bad decision there, it could blow everything up. You know? So it's good to have that information.
And I know the forest would be really interested in that because it's very close to the boundary. We have a lot of projects that tie into that. We're trying to reduce sedimentation into the Verde River, like we would.
Yeah,
So that might be something. that
yeah,
we can provide
again, with
additional-
the resources, I can tell you, we're looking at even our reclamation facility and expansion and some of the water needs, that gets into mitigation for the Verde.
Mhm.
And, I'm one of the few probably TAC members that not only does transportation, but I'm over utilities too. So I see we all use the same water around here. It's all one aquifer that Prescott Valley, Dewey, Humboldt. Maybe, I don't know about Dewey, they may be in the aquifer, but we all got straws in the same cup.
Yeah.
And the Verde River is the big, everything runs into the Verde River. So from an environmental standpoint,
it was
that's huge as well. And it gets into wildlife with birds and riparian areas and some of the conservation easements that they have around the Verde as well. So,
it's sad that the Del Rio Springs, that apparently the water level there has really diminished over the last few years.
well,
Because
probably 2.5 feet a year for the last 20+ years.
Because
So,
when I got to go out there years ago, the Sierra Club and some other group took us out there, it was like a marsh, your
Yeah,
feet
it's
got wet
dry
and
now.
it literally was bubbling out of the ground.
yeah, it used to be an actual spring.
Is it not even coming above the
No,
land
not
anymore?
anymore. I mean, that's the aquifers dropped 40-50 feet over past since 2000. So it's just the nature of it. But the good news is, like Chino Valley, for example, partnered with the Nature Conservancy
Yes.
for some groundwater modeling studies up in that area to try and pinpoint mitigation areas and things. So,
That's great.
and like I
When's our
said,
next meeting?
well, when we get to it, we're still fighting with ADWR over the models. That's a whole nother thing. But
Dana, if I could just add just a closing comment, just
Yes.
again, want to thank everyone for your participation today. As we all know, these can kind of be a little bit of a, prickly at times because we're trying to take something that's not working perfectly and kind of poke it and poke each other. But in all honesty, with all due respect, respectful process, thank you all. Thank you for opening it up. And we're going to, again, do this monthly, if you will, to keep working towards a final outcome that's cleaned up, spelled out. So really want to thank you as a committee, thank Frank as a liaison, thank the CYMPO staff, but thank Dana, Cynthia, and Justin as your team. So thank you, Dana. What is our next step at this point?
Coordinating for our next meeting date. But thank you all for your time today.
Are you on KYCA today?
I am not. I think it's next Wednesday. It's coming up. It's not today.
Okay.
It's, I'll tell you.
Executive was on the 20th.
Executive meetings next Wednesday, the 20th. I'm on KYC on the 27th.
27th?
Can be on the radio.
So, thank you all.
Everybody.
Appreciate it.
Thank you all very much.
And Bryn is the project manager, so I got something, call her.
I didn't say that at the top, I meant to. Connect with me if you've got ideas.
Is the project manager.
Lucky you, Bryn, yes.
I didn't even mention the mine, did I? Oh, wait,
Chino?
there we did. Yeah.
When's that meeting? The 21st?
Oh, the reclamation meeting? I don't
I
know.
don't know. Someone,
It's not in Chino.
no, it's
We're all at council.
Red arrow.
It's Heights.
Williamson, right?
The Heights, right outside.
Yeah, I live right on the
Literally
other
wrap-
side of that
We
mountain.
almost wrapped around it.
I live right on the other side of it, and just heard about it the other day. I'm like, what?
Yeah,
That's intense.
that's what it boils down to. Everyone's coming to Chino Valley, but it's actually outside of our town limits. and
Right,
In the
because it's
unincorporated.
unincorporated, yeah.
But Dan Cherry, I said, well, wouldn't your zoning prohibit that?
Yeah, what is the deal on it?
He says that there's some really old legislation that prohibits counties from any. It comes down to, you don't screw railroads, irrigation, water, mineral rights. And so I don't know that the county staff is, they have able to restrict.
Again, I see all the time, but I started
Brown.
on the computer.
Well, yours-
Looking at history, feeling good.
I talked, and so we're getting all these calls. This is Greg. The only thing we'll get is more coming down 5 north.
Yeah.
Don't have any truck routes prohibited trucks. I doubt we could prohibit